and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we'll be continuing where we left off, discussing some openings of Beethoven sonatas. In the first episode, we considered some rather conventional openings. In these pieces, Beethoven clearly established the key and the character, and there was very little ambiguity present, regardless of how well or poorly one plays it. Now, we're going to consider some less conventional openings, ones in which we as pianists have a much more difficult job determining what is happening and how best to communicate it to our audience. Furthermore, these openings may require us to act just a little more, because an honest or direct rendition may not necessarily be as effective as one that is juiced up a little bit. So, let us begin. This is one of the most famous openings in the sonatas, and for good reason. On the surface level, there's drama, there's passion, and there's unpredictability. If we go deeper and look at the construction, we find a delicate balance between familiar concepts and Beethovenian risks that warrant our attention. Let's start by considering our precepts from the previous episode. Does Beethoven establish a key here? Well, yes and no. It's conventional in that we have an opening statement that appears to establish C minor. However, as he continues the motive from the beginning, he pushes the piece into the relative major of E flat, even going so far as to put in a Baroque-style free cadenza to match the Baroque rhythms from the beginning. This key does not last, however, and Beethoven eventually makes his way to D major. Now this is merely a harmonic setup, the purpose of which is to lead to a long G chord as the dominant of C. What helps us, as listeners, is that Beethoven holds onto the G dominant and moves around it, always coming back with auditory clues to tell us that this G must eventually resolve to C minor, setting up the faster section. In this way, Beethoven gives us just enough harmonic uncertainty to make this opening appear unsettled but not unplanned. And it's one of the reasons why the resolution to C minor at the start of the fast section is so satisfying. Now, let's consider the character of the opening. Everything here is about direct contrast, whether it takes the form of dynamic, or register, or rhythmic character. He forces fortissimo to directly and abruptly interrupt piano in the E-flat major section. Even the very opening itself is marked as a heavy accent, a forte piano. When it comes to register, he changes the register alongside his changes in dynamic, again reinforcing the idea of contrast. The most interesting contrast facet is the one displayed between the rhythmic sections and the cadential. The dotted rhythm has a march-like quality to it. And this is reinforced when the left hand is given straight sixteenths to go alongside. It almost feels frighteningly inevitable. And yet, when we do reach moments where the notes flow like oil, the rhythmic support collapses. Notice how, the first time, Beethoven lets the left-hand rhythm drop out entirely. The second time, he goes back and forth between freedom and structure, almost unsure. The final run serves the purpose of removing the previous rhythmic structure and preparing the new one to take hold. What you have here is Beethoven carefully constructing and balancing an opening of contrasts, where you as a listener are given a set of parameters that never seem settled. Every time you think you have the character or key of the piece figured out, Beethoven abruptly changes it. But it should be noted that he never steps outside his aesthetic boundary in terms of what he can and cannot do. In this style, he can contrast with dynamic, but this contrast happens in concert with shifts in register or rhythm, never at a random point or in the middle of a phrase. Yes, he is keeping us on our toes, but it is organized enough to not appear random. Now, as a pianist, how do we go about performing this kind of work? What I mean is, Can we play this directly, or do we need to consider a layer underneath? A tough question, and as usual, there's a complex answer. First, we have to ask ourselves this: does the piece work if played literally from the score? Well, yes and no. The march sections work fine in general, but the fast scales, if played literally in time, are a bit of a mess. On a more subtle level, the acoustic situation forces us to take time between the hard contrasts, especially when going from loud to soft. The transfer from fortissimo to piano here requires us to wait slightly so the sound can evaporate. If we don't, then the soft part is not heard, at least at the beginning, and in a large hall on a concert grand, there's even more reason to wait. When we look at the musical gestures, we find again moments where things work as written, like the opening slur. But when we get to the last section, where Beethoven is questioning nearly everything, we find one of the few deceptive cadences in this opening, and this cannot be played straight at all. This situation requires us to do a little acting, not in terms of body or face, but in terms of musical intention and direction. Let's look into this in more depth, because it's the core of what this episode is about. When we act in music, we're essentially exaggerating our interpretation of the work in order that effects become more noticeable and have the potential to impact our audience in a more powerful way. This simple case of a deceptive cadence is one worth understanding. In short, we expect to hear this. Instead, we get this. Beethoven leads to this point beforehand, but notice that if I replace the real version with a proper cadence, we find ourselves in no man's land musically, with nowhere to go afterwards. Even though this is the logical result of following the harmony, it effectively stops everything. But this final result is not in the minds of the listeners. We only hear the intention of going to this final chord. In other words, our minds think, okay, he's here, and he'll most likely go here. When he goes here instead, we're surprised. This surprise is important to understand as a performer. It's like having good timing when you're telling a joke. The joke here is being played on the audience, and it's up to the performer to not muck it up. Unlike the conventional openings I've discussed in another episode, unconventional openings in Beethoven require us to emotionally manipulate our audiences in a much more subtle or less direct way. Beethoven does most of the work, of course. He sets up clear contrasts, which will encourage a listener to react in a general, though reasonably predictable manner. But what we as pianists must recognize and exploit are the unspoken and assumed expectations of our audience. Whether or not a listener understands musical harmony or structure, it's nearly universal in Western music that a dominant chord resolves to a tonic chord, like in the previous example. Even if we can't explain it intellectually, we can definitely feel it emotionally on both a conscious and unconscious level. When Beethoven disrupts this expectation, he's playing a joke on his audience, but he's assuming that the pianist fully understands the joke that is being played, and thus can play it with a high level of effectiveness. With this in mind, what do we do with the deceptive cadence? Beethoven doesn't give us any indication of what he wants, which means that we have a buffer of freedom within which we can play. First off, it doesn't work if played directly, using the same sound quality and timing as if we were playing a proper cadence. The deceptive cadence would sit on the A-flat major chord in a way that contradicts the contradiction. To be clear, the deceptive part of the chord is its harmony. This is what the audience doesn't expect. But the change in harmony forces us to change everything else about the chord as well, in order to show the audience that it is intentional by the composer and not a mistake. If we played it as is, a listener could disregard the seriousness of the piece due to faulty construction. But if we change our sound quality and maybe delay the chord just a wee bit, the chord will sound as if it is a surprise, and a genuine one, and not by accident. In many ways, this attempt to sell something as the genuine article is the foundation of artistic interpretation. If at any moment the audience doesn't believe what we're doing, then we've failed as artists. Subtle jokes like these are not the only things we must control. Consider the use of 3 in this piece. I've talked about this before in another episode, but it's worth mentioning here again, because it directly affects the perception of this piece. First, we have this. Then we have it a second time, reinforcing the key. The third time, we get something similar but different. Beethoven is harnessing a universal human trait, that of recognizing patterns. We always need 2 similar occurrences in order to establish a potential pattern. One situation can be unique, but 2 is either coincidental or a pattern. Beethoven is assuming that the listener, after hearing the first 2, will expect to hear a third in the same vein, like this. Instead, he, once again, plays a joke on the audience, though it's less of a ha-ha joke and more of an I have a better idea joke. Given this knowledge, how do we play it? Well, the first 2 can be played honestly or directly. The third, in order for the joke to work, must start out as if it is what we expect. But then there is an insistence that happens to reinforce the new idea. In exaggerated format, the third one sounds like this. What does this do? Our audience recognizes the difference and the insistence of the gesture as well. This encourages them to follow us as we lead them to a different musical situation. It's as if we've extended a hand to them. This is what I mean by acting. All too often, acting in musical performance is observed as being a physical manifestation of our internal emotions or the emotions we see in the music that we are trying to project. If it's loud and heroic, a pianist may throw their hands in the air to show how powerfully they are playing. Or if the piece is soft and dreamy, a pianist may look into the rafters to show their divine inspiration to the audience. This kind of show is not necessarily a bad thing. It's only useless if your listener happens to be listening with their eyes shut. The acting that I advocate is the style that is based entirely in the sound world, where all you need are ears and a reasonably good memory to recognize musical patterns and when they are disrupted or enhanced. In many ways, Beethoven appears to work in the same realm. He does not depend on external gestures as often, for example, as Liszt. But it is important to be able to act in this manner as a pianist because we really are at a significant disadvantage with our instrument in terms of sonic variation. And we have to make up for this by providing contrast in other ways. With everything that I've talked about, let's consider another opening now, which is similar in many respects. Listen for the key, listen to contrasts of register or figuration, and of course, notice how Beethoven plays around with expectation. This opening could withstand the same scrutiny as a Pathétique, but I think you understand what I'm getting at. In this opening, Beethoven establishes the key of C major only to disrupt it each time it appears. It takes a really long time in this piece for C major to return as a home key. So in this way it is more complex structurally than the opening of the Pathétique. The texture is rather unified for the most part, so in this way it is simpler than the Pathétique. The contrast here comes from the difference between the motor that begins the piece and the second theme, which is much more relaxed and melodic. In terms of Beethoven playing around with the expectations of his audience, he appears to rely on harmonic surprises rather than gestural or melodic ones. The change from C major to G major to begin the piece is surprising enough. But his change to C minor is perhaps the most striking of all, because it directly contradicts what we heard at the beginning. harmonic instability actually informs us how to approach playing the second theme. And this in turn informs us how to play the opening. It's kind of a paradox, but I'll explain it briefly. The second theme is enclosed harmonically, and it is very stable. With the helpful markings of dolce molto legato, we're encouraged to take time at this point and allow the listener to revel in harmonic stability for the first time in the piece. If we consider that this section and the opening stand in complete contrast to each other, then we are encouraged to take the opposite strategy when playing the opening. Here's what I mean. The second theme is soft, harmonically stable, and melodious. We're not pushing a rigid rhythmic structure. The melody is flexible according to the needs of the notes. This means that the most effective way of providing a contrast in our opening section would be to have a strict rhythmic structure. In terms of acting, we're required to play nearly metronomically in this opening, with allowances for accents on and off the beat, in order to maintain order and communicate to the audience how impossibly rigid this rhythm actually is. Consider for a moment what would happen if we didn't do this. Let's allow the rhythm the freedom to move with the harmonic surprises, and allow deceleration and acceleration based on gestures or dynamics. This looseness in the opening means that the looseness in the second theme is inconsequential, because it is no longer a contrast. Ultimately, these openings involve understanding the world that Beethoven is trying to create and the rules that govern this world. Conventional openings are easy, precisely because we only have to present the world. Beethoven provides the rules without our help, and usually by shouting them at the audience. Unconventional openings, on the other hand, require us to present the world and the rules explicitly, because Beethoven bends and breaks the rules in order to surprise his audience. If the audience doesn't understand the rules, then they won't get the joke. The next level that we'll consider involves openings that are ambiguous to a point of near confusion, and another episode will touch upon this. This is important because we have to walk along a very fine line. There's a big difference between playing with an audience's expectation and covertly introducing and then manipulating expectations where none actually exist. Fun stuff. So, until next time, keep practicing and search for the jokes that composers play on their listeners. There are far more than one might suspect, and it'll definitely enrich your own interpretation of a piece. Bye for now.